Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. And it's a great privilege for me to invite you here. Massey College, this beautiful college, is on Indigenous land, the cherished land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We always want to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and express our gratitude for the ability that we have to meet here, even virtually. Massey loves to read, and it also has had a long engagement with the media and the journalism profession. So it's a delight to be today celebrating a book and a book by a journalist about a long career in the media. So I am so delighted that we are able to support and launch the book of Norman Webster. So I just want to say how much this is important for Massey to celebrate good books and good books about meaningful lives like the one of Norman Webster. So without further ado, I'm just going to say enjoy your evening, and I look forward to seeing you maybe on the other side of the pandemic.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Scott, and I'm the publisher of Barlow Books. It's been a real pleasure for me to publish Norman Webster's book, Newspapering, 50 Years of Reporting from Canada and around the world. As you already know, Norman is one of Canada's great columnists, and I'm sure you'll be delighted, as I was, to read Norman's columns from China in the early 70s, from the UK of Maggie Thatcher, and from around the world. Now, for those of us who were in Quebec for the never-ending referendum, Norman's columns bring back a lot of memories. And at a time like this, they remind us how remarkable it is that Quebecers managed to resolve the sovereignty issue in such a peaceful way. Now, Norman was a distinguished editor, both at the Globe and Mail, of course, and at the Gazette in Montreal, where I was a reporter, mainly writing about politics. After I returned to Montreal from Quebec City, it was Norman who gave me the chance of a lifetime to work in Europe for 5 months as Southam News foreign correspondent. And this was at a historic time, just after the wall fell. It was a real thrill for me. And Norman, I want to thank you once again for giving me this wonderful chance. Now, as publisher of Barlow Books, it's been wonderful to work with Norman and with his family to turn these articles into a book. I want to thank our whole design and production team for creating this beautiful book and during a pandemic. I also want to thank John Fraser for writing an eloquent introduction to Norman's book. Now, John, as you all know, is chair of the National News Media Council and Master Emeritus of Massey College. He's generously agreed to host this virtual launch. So I want to thank you all, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Natalie and Sarah. I'm not virtual, I'm live. So if I screw up, it'll be in real time. So pray for me. I'm really honored to be able to take on this role because Norman Webster is one of my heroes. And this is, as Sarah said, I got a chance to write the introduction. But what I want to do is, first of all, tell you, you better get the book. Here it is. And if you haven't got it, you'll be able to find out how to get it at the end of our program, of our launch. It's just for me to get things started. And going over Norman's career, it's just wild. He's been so many things in this long career. He's been a sports reporter, an Ottawa reporter, Queen's Park reporter, a China bureau chief, a Rhodes Scholar, a London bureau chief, columnist for the Globe and Mail, editor-in-chief of the Gazette, editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, author, benefactor, savior of Saturday Night Magazine, university chancellor, husband, father, grandfather, everyone who's going to take part in tonight's book launch. And also, just as well, a dear friend to many who are listening and watching. I know him because I've been tracking him for a long time. I've been tracking behind him at Oxford, at the Globe, in China, in London, at Saturday Night. For many of the people talking tonight, he was the holder of the keys that let us do what we wanted to do in journalism. There's gratitude here, of course, but also an extraordinary amount of affection and deep respect. And that doesn't come to every boss, I can assure you. Let me also tell you that the guy has guts, whether it's dealing with difficult publishers, and I've been a witness to that, prime ministers and cabinet ministers, hockey players on the ice and probably off the ice, angry subordinates, or even worse, pleading subordinates who wanted foreign postings, Conrad Black, and to everyone he dealt with, he presented a true version of himself, practical, decent, honorable, and a hell of a round. Right now, Norman is also fighting a formidable health challenge, but with the same courage and the same resolve that he has dealt with in every challenge throughout his life. So with no further ado, let's hear from the man himself in a series of short vignettes he recorded with his son, Derek Webster. And it begins with the question of how did he become a journalist in the first place? Over to you, Norman.
Well, when I was a young tad in Sherbrooke, Quebec, I was a keen sports fan, and that led naturally to the paths which led to the Sherbrooke Daily Record on Wellington Street, and its emperor, Len O'Donnell, a giant of sports journalism, who wrote a column every week entitled Sport Shots and Pot Shots, and he took his pot shots on the local sporting heroes and watched the wires coming in, and he had just a fabulous job. I couldn't think of anything better, and that's probably why I started as a journalist.
What were the early newsrooms like?
Well, I don't know what everyone's newsroom was, but I know what mine was at the Globe and Mail. It was a bit of a pigsty. There were desks lined up in a row with teetering towers of paper on top of them. There was the teletype machine yammering away the whole time. There were typewriters, and these are old-fashioned typewriters. Tremendous noisemakers. Every time anyone started a story, there was just a racket. There were copy boys, and people yelled for copy boys occasionally. Even there were the phones were ringing, of course, and people, because of the background noise, people were always shouting to get above it, which meant that the whole place was a cacophony of journalism. Who knows? But the results weren't bad. But and everyone was smoking, of course. It was impossible to envisage a newsroom without a blanket of smoke. And I must say that one of the things I'm most pleased about from my time at the Globe and Mail was we were able to cut smoking out of newsrooms, which led to other places, and we had an influence on public policy when it came to tobacco and compulsive smoking. My mother gave me a journalist notebook for Christmas one year, and I carried that around in my back pocket for a while. And eventually, indeed, one summer when I was working for the Record, I got Len's post for 2 weeks when he went on holiday, and that was a wonderful time. Interestingly enough, I was not asked to write sport shots and pot shots. Len wasn't stupid. He kept a pretty tough hold on that local post, and as I say, became a giant in his own right.
Norman's going to come back at the end of the launch, but right now I'm going to hand over these proceedings to Michael Goldbloom, the principal of Bishop's University in Lennoxville, just down the road from North Hatley in the Eastern Townships, where Norman and Pat Webster make their home. Like Norman, like me, Michael Goldbloom is, and everybody else that's going to be introduced tonight, Michael Goldbloom is a known survivor of the newspaper business and can still put a smile on his face, which is good. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, John. It's an honor to have been asked to participate in the launching of Norman's book. One of my dad's claims to fame was that he had been the editor of the student literary magazine at Lower Canada College. And Hugh McLennan was his English and Latin teacher. And Dad published a story by Hugh that was later expanded to become Barometer Rising. So Dad always boasted about being Hugh's editor. And one of my proudest moments of my career is that I get to claim that I got to be Norman's publisher during my time at the Gazette. One of my favorite moments every week was when Norman would drop off his column. He would stop by my office and we would talk about politics or Conrad Black or the latest language shenanigans. And although I think actually we spent more time talking about the sorry state of the Habs than really anything else. Now, it's said that journalism is the first draft of history. What struck me as I read Norman's book last weekend is how perceptive his columns are. In reading some compilations of other journalists' columns, you sometimes feel that the columns haven't aged very well. But that's certainly not true with Norman's columns. He had a remarkable ability to distill the enduring essence of a person or an event. And his columns are filled with wit and wisdom, and you really do feel like they could have been written today. Now, we've assembled a great group of Norman's colleagues who are going to share some thoughts and stories. But before introducing our first panel, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about Norman's time at Bishop's. In one of his columns in the book, Norman writes that he had been the editor of 3 newspapers during his career, obviously the Globe and the Gazette. But he says that being the editor of the campus at Bishop's, so the student newspaper, was both the most difficult and the most satisfying of the 3, because he was in daily direct contact with his readers. I can assure you, you're going to enjoy reading the column about the reaction he got when he wrote a column calling for the end of the requirement for students to wear academic gowns to class. I won't tell you about the reaction, you'll read the column. Now, Norman, when he was at Bishop's, wasn't only the editor of the student newspaper, he was also Bishop's correspondent and a columnist for what was then the Sherbrooke Daily Record. He was also responsible for all of the publications at the Student Council. And I came across this doing a little bit of research. His nickname was Better Late Than Never Webster, which strikes me as not exactly the ideal nickname for an aspiring journalist. Norman was a member of the debating team. In fact, he and a colleague, they won the National Debating Championship in Canada 2 years in a row. When he graduated, he received the highest non-academic award at the university, which is given to members of the graduating class who are considered by their classmates as having contributed the most to the university. Norman also served for 17 years on our board of governors. So when I was approached about the possibility of coming to Bishop's to become the principal, the first person I turned to was Norman. And those of you who know Norman well will know that he's cautious and measured when giving advice. But near the end of our lunch, he said to me, "Michael, Bishop's is a place you can fall in love with." And he was right. So Norman and Pat have been generous supporters of Bishop's. They've been strong advocates for higher education in Canada. And most importantly for me and Fiona, they have been really very great friends. So I'm very grateful to both of them. So I'm now going to invite four of Norman's colleagues to share recollections of working with him. Geoff Stevens, whose friendship with Norman dates back to I think the mid-1960s, when they worked together in the Ottawa Bureau of the Globe and Mail. And then when Norman was the Globe's editor, Geoff was his managing editor. Sylvia Stead, who joined the Globe in 1975 and who is now the Globe's public editor. Joan Fraser, who was the editorial page editor of the Gazette when Norman was the editor. And then Joan succeeded Norman as editor when Norman stepped down. And finally, Michel Cormier. Michel is a former CBC correspondent, the author of a book on China, former head of news and current affairs at Radio-Canada. And of course, like Norman, he spent time reporting from Beijing. So really looking forward to hearing from the four of you. And so over to you.
We have a few minutes to talk. And one of the things that has come up several times, I think, is the quality of Norman's writing. One of the things that struck me reading this absolutely terrific book is his amazing gift for seeing one human detail that brings home a whole broad context. I think I'd like to ask Geoff, because you've known him longest, was he always that kind of a journalist? I'm thinking in the book, for example, there's a little anecdote from Tibet of watching a man going around a temple, falling off his crutches because he couldn't walk to pray, and then clawing himself up again, taking a step, falling again to pray, and on for several hours until he had done the circuit. And that brought home to me, as few things ever have, the deep place of religion in Tibetan society. Was he always like that? Did he always have that gift, or was it honed over the years? Geoff.
I think, Joan, he always had that gift. He had that gift, but he certainly honed it over the years. I mean, he was always a terrific writer, and he discovered as his career went on, the way to really reach universal truths was to start with the individual, with the anecdote, the small scene, as you described, of the old man in Tibet. He did that on a number of occasions, even with politicians. He could talk certain things concerning those politicians and broaden it out into a discussion of the issues and the concerns. It was a way of sort of universalizing the particular, and he had that skill. And he wrote very well. I mean, he had a sense of humor and a whimsy to some of the things that he wrote, and an ability to take serious subjects and make them sort of, by understating them, make people understand how significant they were. You know, understated a bit, and people see, my God, yes, I see what he's saying. You know, and he had an ability to establish sort of the dimensions of a story, quite often by starting with the particular and moving to the universal. He's just a great writer, and it shows up in so many of the stories in this book. I mean, it is really fun to read.
Yes, it is. And you talk about the whimsy. Things that struck me in this book was how often he would be addressing something really very serious, and then, just to keep us in perspective, his getaway line has a wry, almost sarcastic, but not quite, quality. So you have to remember, life is big. There's more to it than just this terrible story I happen to be telling you right now. Sylvia, did you ever edit his copy? Sorry, Geoff?
No, I was going to say that's absolutely true. I mean, Norman took the subjects he dealt with very seriously. He took his work very seriously, but he never took himself, has never taken himself very seriously, and that's part of the charm. He could sort of be a bit whimsical and say, I saw this, but, there you go.
Yeah. Sylvia, did you ever edit Norman's copy?
I did not. I was a reporter when he left, and As far as I know, I was never edited by him either, which I think I would have appreciated greatly given what you have said, John, about his light touch and understanding of the writer's voice. But no, sadly, no, I was never on either end of that.
Oh, well, you would have appreciated, as an editor yourself, you would have appreciated being edited by him because it was very subtle, very deft, as you say, very respectful of the writer. But if he did have a point that he thought needed to be made, he would find the most subtle, non-intrusive, but important way to do it. An amazing editor, as well as an amazing reporter. Michel, when you went to China, what did you think had changed since Norman was there, based on what you knew of his time?
Well, I mean, the China I came to was even more developed than the one that Jeff and Norman went to visit Jan Wong. It was like massive car jams on the highways, and they were building a ring road every couple of years to go around Beijing. We were down up to 5 or almost 6 at the time by the time we left. And the stories I was doing and trying to do them in the same way as Jeff through the lives of ordinary people were about the Chinese getting credit cards and trying to manage credit cards for the first time in their lives, buying a house and getting a mortgage and seeing the value of the house drop after the Olympic Games, for example, and not knowing how that happened because the sellers had told them the value would double every year. So this was the China I was living in, and it was a totally, but the development was so humongous. They would build bridges in a weekend, or build a new road, or build skyscrapers in such quick succession. All the major brands, Western brands, coming into Beijing, and the Chinese learning to live with consumer society. So it was a huge revolution, but totally different than the one that Norman lived through when he was there.
I think we're running out of time. I'm pretty sure that we could all go on for a long, long time about Norman, but to wrap this bit up, perhaps I can dare to speak for all of us to say thank you, Norman, for all that you have done and all that you have been to all of us.
Thank you, Jeff, Joan, Michel, and Sylvia. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lucinda Chodan. Lucinda is the editor-in-chief of the Gazette and senior vice president at Post Media. Lucinda.
My name is Lucinda Chodan, and I'm currently senior vice president of content for Post Media and editor-in-chief of the Montreal Gazette. But back in the early 1990s, when Norman was at the Gazette, I was a relatively green manager who had just been put in charge of the weekend editions. There were many daunting elements of this new job for me. One was the curmudgeonly night desk, most of whose members thought I had absolutely no business supervising the weekend papers, a suspicion I secretly shared. Another was the constitution of the newsroom at that time. We had 2 co-managing editors. One was nicknamed Fluffy and one was nicknamed Stuffy. I was on Team Fluffy, which didn't really help my self-esteem. But nothing was more daunting to me than the prospect of going into Norman's office late on a Friday afternoon to tell him about my weekend plans for the Saturday and Sunday editions. Norman was viewed with reverence by my cohort of young, idealistic journalists at the Gazette. He was a former international correspondent, he'd been editor of the Globe, and his columns rang with sophistication and worldliness. He moved through the newsroom with quiet authority, nodding at people quietly as he passed. I thought he was the epitome of unostentatious leadership. No wonder I was apprehensive about coming in to talk to him about my plans for the weekend. I agonized over my front page calls and hoped I wouldn't have to tell him about too many stories involving baton-twirling nuns or recipes for spotted dick, 2 actual Sunday edition stories. When I got to his office overlooking St. Antoine Street, Norman was invariably attentive. He listened silently and intensely as I went through my plans, and almost every week he would ask at least one quiet, terrifying question about the one story or element I was uncertain about. It was always a question informed with knowledge and insight. I almost always sputtered while trying to answer it, and invariably his question made the story that I ended up running better and smarter than it would have been if he hadn't asked. From my point of view, Norman's influence at the Gazette was profound. His columns on subjects like the Middle East peace talks, deterioration of Somalia, the failure of the Charlottetown Accord made the Gazette a better and more sophisticated newspaper. But even more importantly, his high expectations and his commitment to intelligent journalism raised the bar for all of us. I later came to know Norman as someone of great kindness and a complete lack of pretension. He also has a delightful sense of humor that is evident in this collection. I recommend A History of Folly. The list of clods and losers is long but funny, although there are many other excellent suggestions in this vein. But for sheer, elegant understanding of the opening up of China, of Maggie Thatcher's UK, or of the nuanced relationship between Canada and Quebec as seen by someone who has traveled the world and come back home, I suggest you start at the beginning and just try to stop reading. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you, Lucinda. That was great. So we thought we would continue with our own hot stove league so that we can talk about Norman's passion for sport, both as an athlete and as a columnist. And I'm going to be joined by three of Canada's most distinguished writers, Douglas Gibson, Roy MacGregor, and Geoffrey Simpson. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. I thought I would start with Roy and Jeff, perhaps, to talk about Norman, the athlete. So, Roy, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Jeff. So, Roy, over to you.
Yeah, well, I played hockey with Normie, as we all called him. There was no Norman in our dressing room. And Normie was beloved in our hockey beer league group because he was a right shot, and we had very few of them. He was active at both ends of the ice, which not everybody approved of, and he was very, very reluctant to get off the ice, which they all mentioned to me when I wrote to them and asked what they remembered about playing with Normie. But the greatest memory of all, even though he's a fine player and he scored lots of goals and we had lots of fun, Normie's the cheapest person I've ever met. His underwear was absolutely astonishing. He looked like Pa Kettle coming out of the outhouse. And the guys always remarked about it and joked about it. They couldn't understand how it even held together. We went up to Huntsville and played in a tournament up there. We went out to dinner at the Norseman. And we brought out this wonderful package all wrapped up as a present. We presented it to Normie. Normie opened it up. It was a brand new set of long johns, the real full set. It was gray and it was with red stripes. Do you think he was insulted? He thought it was the greatest thing that he'd ever been given, and he wore it for years.
That's great. Jeff, can you match that on Norman the athlete?
I don't know anything about his underwear. I'm sorry. I strike out on that one. But I remember him. This is just a lead into his athleticism. When I was a young stripling person at the Globe and Webster was wandering around, and he used to wear hush puppies. Remember hush puppies?
Yeah.
And he drove this little car, and he was the most modest person, but he also was modest in physique. I mean, we weren't talking about somebody 6'3" and 210, not some athletic looking guy. And it was much later that I realized that he was a, how do you describe it, fanatical, dedicated runner. And then he moved from running into other things. And one year we invited him and Pat to our cottage. Now, normally when you're a guest at a cottage, having been a guest and being a cottage owner, the guests arrive, you say hi, you sit down, you have a drink, you start talking, then you decide, what are we going to do? Norman comes, gets out of the car, and he says, I think I'd like to run the road we just drove down. So he gets on his running shoes and his shorts and he runs the road. That was about an hour. And then he came, and rather than sitting down and drinking and chatting with us, he decides, I'm going to swim the bay. Well, it's a big bay. And he swam over and he swam back. Now, he wasn't being antisocial, but that's just the kind of dedicated athlete he was. I don't think very many people here today would realize that he kept this up at a highly competitive level for a long time. He competed in 100 marathons or so, mostly in Canada. And he represented Canada internationally in his age category at the World Triathlon Championships in 1992 in Muskoka, Roy's old part of the world, at age 51, in Manchester in 1993 at age 52, Queensland, New Zealand, age 63 in 2004, and Beijing in 2011 at the age of 70. Now, how many people can even dream of doing that? And the Beijing aquathlon, as it was called, was just swimming and running, no biking, too bad. And he was also the Quebec champion in his age category in 1991, 92, 93, when he was 50, 51, and 52. So he competed internationally in aquathlons, triathlons, and he was the Quebec champion in his age category when he was 50, 51, and 52. And when you take a look at the guy, as I say, he doesn't look like somebody whose muscles are, everywhere. But by God, he was dedicated, and he was good, and he was consistent. And it's a part of him that he would never talk about. And he sometimes, I think I'm right in saying that he did that event in Beijing with one of his sons, who, needless to say, was a good deal younger than he was. And so he's an extraordinary guy when it came to more than just playing hockey. And one last thing, he loved talking, Roy, you know this, he loved talking about the Montreal Canadiens. I mean, the Habs were up, the Habs were down, he was up, he was down. And it's been tough for him in recent years. That's all I can say, modestly. As an Ottawa Senators fan, I can say that.
I was thinking, I remember when Norman turned 60, most people don't like getting older, but he was so thrilled to become 60 because he moved into a higher age bracket. So he was the youngest in his new age bracket for his competitions. Yeah. So, Doug, what about Norman, the sports writer?
Well, Norman was an amazing sports writer. When he was stationed supposedly in London, he wasn't really stationed in London. The family lived in Wimbledon. And Wimbledon, for a couple of weeks in the middle of summer each year, was transformed as the place that was the center of the All England Tennis Championships. And Norman and the neighbors used to drop around and visit the outer courts in the early rounds. And then he got to know a number of the writers. And other people stationed in London thought that what was going on at Downing Street or in Westminster in Maggie Thatcher's time was pretty important. But Norman knew that the real story was what was happening in Wimbledon. And when he was there reporting on it, suddenly the sports writer in Norman came leaping out, unashamed, and it was obvious that this was the real story. And around 1980, the real story involved huge figures like Chris Evert or Martina Navratilova, still enormous names. And then, of course, most famously of all was the 1980 tennis men's final between Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe.
Right.
And that changed the rules of tennis. Because in those days, there was no such thing as a tie-break arrangement. Every single set had to be won by a 2-game lead. And Borg was the champ and McEnroe was the up-and-comer. And in this case, Borg just needed to get the 4th set to win the championship again. But that 4th set went on until it was decided in favor of McEnroe at 18-16. There were heart attacks all around. But then Norman, the sportsman, knew that the real story was how Borg, incredibly, with ice water in his veins, managed to come back from losing that fourth set to win the fifth set. And it, as I say, it changed the rules of tennis. And Norman was there with his pen at the ready, just exulting in this wonderful, wonderful role of sports writer. And he was very, very good at it.
I would just add to that, Doug, and I followed Norman as a correspondent in London. And there was a little plaque on a seat in the press gallery at Wimbledon that said Globe and Mail on it. That was the most precious bloody thing that you could get in the United Kingdom, next to having a permanent invitation to Buckingham Palace. And I followed him covering the golf tournament because he's a lovely golfer, likes playing golf. And I, used to get passes and say, well, Mr. Webster was here. I'm just following in his footsteps. And I think and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, I think he went off and covered the Canadian ski team because they were the crazy Canucks in those days. Ken Reid, Podborski, Todd Booker. I couldn't go down a ski slope to save my life, but he'd done it, and he'd done it with great skill. And so I went off and covered skiing, and I knew nothing about skiing, nothing. I'm a terrible, terrible skier. But I had the good sense to ask people who knew how to do it. Well, I don't know that Norman's a great downhill skier. Maybe he is, but he was such a damn good writer that he wrote these lovely pieces, as I remember. Maybe I'm getting it wrong and memory's playing fake. But you're right about his sports writing. He loved all kinds of sports. He even liked cricket.
Yes.
And tried to persuade me that when I was in London, I really should pay attention to cricket. And
Right.
I had been a graduate student in London, and I thought it was the dumbest game ever invented. And nothing that he said or wrote could persuade me otherwise. And I still think it to this day.
Well, I have the broken fingers to show that cricket is an interesting game.
But you're a Scotsman.
Yep.
So you were mentioning about Norman the golfer. I wanted to share a golf story. So I came to Bishop's in 2008. Didn't really know anybody here. And I called Norman and I said, Norman, you want to play a round of golf? So we decided to go and play at the Bishop's has its own golf course, probably one of the few universities in the country that does, the old Lennoxville. It's a 9-hole course, I think the oldest in the country. So we get to the second tee, and I'm about to hit the ball, and the second hole, it's about 380 yards long, and you can only see the first 100 yards because it falls away down to the right. And just before I hit the ball, Norman says, Michael, you really got to stay to the right here so you can hit the slope and avoid the bunker. Turns out he hadn't played the course in 46 years, but he remembered the hole. I couldn't remember the previous hole we just played, right? And I was thinking, this is like the quintessential Norman Webster, the capacity to observe, to remember, to communicate, the determination and the generosity. So that little moment really kind of encapsulated so much of Norman for me. Well, I think we're probably run out of time already. So I want to say, I think it takes a great athlete to be able to write with the perception that Norman did in writing about all these different sports that we've talked about, and his enormous admiration, particularly for hockey players. And I just think it was in some ways a reflection of his own character. And I think a lot of us would say, I know Norman would say, you learn a lot about a person by the way they play a sport. And I think that was evident in the way that he wrote about athletes. So I want to thank you, Doug. I want to thank you, Roy. Thank you, Jeff. And I guess we'll throw it back to John.
So thank you to everyone that's taken part tonight. What a wonderful set of memories, but it's not over. If you stay tuned at the end of the formal part of the launch, there are wonderful collection more of anecdotes from all the people that you saw. And you've also got to stay tuned because Norman Webster gets to say thank you at the end. And before he does that, make sure you know how to buy this book. And last but not least, I want to pay a special tribute to Pat Webster, who has been Norman's shield and buckler all these years, all these married years, and still there. So with that said, back to Norman. Thank you.
Time now to say goodbye, and for me to send thank yous all around this room and across the journalist world and in our own little world. Thank you to those great metropolitan institutions, Massey College and Bishop University. Thank you to Barlow Books and Sarah Scott, who was just a junior reporter when I last saw her at the Gazette, and now she's the publisher ranging the country. The others, the technicians who've done the work, produced miracles I never would have thought possible. And finally to my family, who have so much supported me in this, which was not an easy task. I always seem to get going up the wrong track, and I've been helped very much by my son Derek, who pointed out things that needed to be pointed out. My son David, especially, who was flying ahead and publishing his own books and took a little time off to get the straight goods on my book. So thanks a lot. Go buy the book.
I'm Jeff Stevens. I have probably known Norman Webster longer than anyone on this panel. Our friendship and newspaper relationship goes back to the mid-1960s, when Norman and I were colleagues together in the Ottawa Bureau of the Globe and Mail. We were both young families. We became good friends and have remained that way ever since. In the weekends, sometimes we would go off to a cottage together. I had a place at that time on Stony Lake in the Kawarthas. We would go up and sit on the veranda late in the evening. Wives would go to bed tired of all this nonsense, and we would sit there and talk about newspapers. We talk about stories. We talk about our dreams of things we could do, and we talk what we might do one day if we ended up running the Globe and Mail. I guess probably young reporters do that. Anyway, eventually Norman became the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, and I became his managing editor. And we did that for some time. A lot of my experiences with Norman involved travel. I recall very well, for example, in 1979, we spent time in the summer that year traveling across Africa together. We were with Joe Clark, who was briefly Prime Minister, and we went to the Commonwealth Conference in Lusaka that year, and then worked our way across to various other African countries. I remember one day we arrived at Kilimanjaro, and we may be the only two visitors into Kilimanjaro who did not see the mountain. And the reason was we arrived very, very late. Joe Clark tended to run behind schedule. And it was dark when we got there. We had to file our stories with great difficulty to the Globe. And in the morning we got up, and it was so foggy you couldn't see the mountain. So we left Kilimanjaro without seeing the mountain. Another time we were traveling in 1989. Norman and I went off and did a tour of the Globe and Mail's foreign bureaus. We had quite a few at that time. We started off, we went to London, Moscow, New Delhi, and eventually we fetched up in Beijing, where Jan Wong was our correspondent. And we spent some time with Jan there. And one day, I guess it was a Monday noon, Norman and I found ourselves in our hotel room in Beijing and watching television. And Norman was dazzled because he had been in Beijing as a correspondent about 20 years before, probably, and he was amazed at the westernization that had taken place since the days of ping pong diplomacy, which he was there at that time. And we were sitting in this watching television, and Norman couldn't stop. He picked up the phone and phoned home to tell his wife, who had been in Beijing with him at that time, that you won't believe this. We are sitting. No, do you know where we are? No, you don't. We're in the Great Wall Hotel in Beijing, and we are watching television, and we're eating cheeseburgers with French fries, and we're watching the Super Bowl on television. That was the change that had come across in China at that time. Norman, like a couple of things about Norman. One thing, Norman was, I wouldn't say Norman was cheap, but Norman was a certain parsimony about him in the early years and didn't like to spend a whole lot of money on anything. Though he quite enjoyed when we went to a cottage and sat there and drank gallons of cheap French wine from the other side of the Ottawa River. And we always favored fairly good cognac, and we would sit on the porch talking about the dreams that we had together. And it was always a good question of what would happen first. Would the sun come out, or would the bottle of Remy Martin be empty? And it was a pretty close tie in most of those cases. I was going to say, a good parsimony. He didn't throw his money around easily in those days. He drove old cars, and one of the old cars that he drove was a Volkswagen, which I could say illustrated another feature of Norman. He, from time to time, had a temper. Nothing made him more annoyed than getting on a phone and trying to dictate his copy to the rewrite desk at the Globe and Mail, which is in those days the way to get the stories in when you were on the road. And usually there were problems with the rewrite desk. On one occasion, I remember he came out of a phone booth just in a fury because the line had been bad and thus the copy taker hadn't taken it down properly. And he got out and he was so angry, he kicked the side of his Volkswagen and caved it in. And he wouldn't get it fixed. He sort of regarded that as a badge of honor. He drove a dented Volkswagen for some years until it died on him. I think that's basically a few things that I say about him, other than I think I'm really looking forward to this book. I've read good parts of it, and I must say, it's excellent.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Stead. I started at the Globe and Mail in 1974 as a summer student, and I'm still there. When I started, Norman was in the Queen's Park Bureau. I think as a columnist, he might have been bureau chief at the time, but that was where I wanted to be. And Norman set the standard, I believe, for political reporting, certainly for people like me, in terms of the example that he set. That it always felt to me like it was a turning point, the kinds of things that Jeff and Norman did with the paper, that it went from being a bit wild, a lot of people who had come up to the reporting levels through the copy messenger level. And some of the political reporting was, to me, a bit too buddy-buddy, whereas Norman, in the way in which he covered Queen's Park, he was tough. He was competitive. He really held the politicians' feet to the fire, but in a way that he was highly respected. I think because he was probably a lot smarter than some of them were. So that was really the benchmark for how to cover politics for me getting in. So that was my first experience, a little bit from afar, but admiring his work and trying to do the same kind of thing when then 5 years later, I was sent to the Bureau as well to cover politics. The next time we had an association was, as Jeff has spoken about, was China. So when the Globe was moving from Front Street to the new building, we had an archivist in looking at all of the stuff in the garage, and Jeff and Norman will remember all that space down there. And included in it were 4 bankers' boxes of material from the foreign bureaus, and there were a couple of files marked ping pong diplomacy, which was just an absolute thrill for me and the archivist to go through, because you would see all of these telegrams, the original photos that Norman took. And I think everyone knows that Norman beat the world, that when the ping pong team was invited there, the big US contingent came in. And at that point, Norman was the only regular English language correspondent. And he knew the quickest way to get the film. And remember this, it was film, rolls of film that then were developed through to Toronto and to be developed. And his pictures ran, of course, in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, I think in the London papers as well, that he beat everyone else by at least a day, if not more. And that's that competitive streak that I think you'll hear more about in terms of sports as well. So that was thrilling to see the way in which work was done then. So the telegrams to send the stories in that he would type in from a telegraph office, the very thin paper that would come in the airmail that would send features, telephone logs. And I also got a call after from Will Slater at the Globe, who was at the other end, who said the newsroom was just so excited working through all of the logistics on the other end of getting the film given to the pilot of a Canadian Press or a Canadian Pacific plane that went, getting through customs and getting the film in. So that competition, that competitiveness from Norman, and also the incredible writing. If you go back and read the stories that he wrote out of China, they were always written from a point of view of respect and understanding of the culture, which can be a danger sometimes in foreign reporting. It can be a little bit looking at the otherness of it, but his was always on point, very clever, and frankly, the same thing he did at Queen's Park. So throughout his career, that was the kind of journalism that we saw from Norman. So I look forward to reading the book to see his insights as well, and to really understand the lessons he has learned as well. So thank you for all of that, Norman.
I'm Joan Fraser. I was the editorial page editor of the Gazette in Montreal when Norman joined us as editor-in-chief. He arrived in tumultuous times: the collapse of the Meech Lake Accord, the Oka crisis, the Charlottetown Accord, the build-up to the next referendum. The country was in peril, and the Gazette was in the eye of the storm, journalistically, which is not an easy place. There were, of course, lighter moments. I remember one meeting that Norman and I had with a relatively important ambassador, but it was late in the day, and oh my, Norman and I were both overcome by sleepiness, propping your eyelids up, disguising your yawns. The ambassador could see what was going on, and in due course took his chilly departure and never asked to come back. But afterwards, all Norman and I could do was just laugh ourselves silly about how idiotic we must have looked. Still, Norman took serious things seriously, obviously. And one example that comes to mind in particular was when the Charlottetown Accord was really boiling. Norman went to a large off-the-record meeting where Pierre Trudeau advanced the startling view that the Charlottetown Accord would allow Quebec to deport Anglophones. Norman thought Canadians should know that Mr. Trudeau was advancing this line of thinking. So many editors, given that the meeting had been off the record, would have sent a reporter to scout around and talk to other people who had been at the meeting and then write down what they told them. But not Norman. If he was going to break confidentiality, he was going to do it publicly, openly, head on. So he wrote a column. And the first part of the column was all about the off-the-record convention and when it should be ignored. And then he reported and refuted Mr. Trudeau's statement. It was an illustration of the fact that however faithful Norman was to journalistic codes, he was even more faithful to his sense of duty to the public. It was what John Fraser calls his dedicated righteous integrity to report what he actually saw. As an editor, Norman had a light touch. He would argue, persuade, discuss, but he would very rarely actually change somebody's copy. He's a marvelous writer himself, and he had, and I'm sure still has, great respect for other writers and respected their work. So it was a particularly gracious gesture when, soon after arriving at the Gazette, he established a prize in the name of his predecessor, Mark Harrison, for writing, for good writing. But those of us who had known and loved Mark had quite a chuckle about this, because although Mark was an excellent writer himself, he never, so far as I know, wrote a line for the Gazette. What he did was edit with a red felt pen that he used like a rapier and sometimes like a broadsword. So you can see the irony of a prize for writing. When Norman left, we established another prize, the Norman Webster Prize for editing. And some of us chuckled to think that this would somehow reestablish the balance of recognizing the styles, the very different styles of these two men. But I must stress that as we chuckled, our chuckles were based on deep respect and real affection for this man. We knew how lucky we were to have worked for Norman Webster, such a superb journalist and such a very fine man.
Hi, I'm Michel Cormier. I don't know Norman Webster as well as the others. We have never even met. But the link that we share is that we've both been correspondents in China and we've both written books about it. And when I was named to China in 2006, some of the required readings for Canadian journalists was, of course, the John Fraser book, The Chinese, and also the iconic coverage of the ping pong diplomacy by Norman Webster. And those were two incredible events where journalists could still then in China, in some rare occasions, actually be part of important events. John Fraser, of course, is known for having addressed tens of thousands of young Chinese in front of the Democracy Wall in the 1970s, which was quite a feat. And Norman Webster, of course, as Sylvia has already said, broke the story or got the pictures and the story of the American delegation and this diplomatic breakthrough of this visit by the ping pong team to Beijing. But what struck me in reading Norman Webster's coverage of that, not only the big geopolitical implications of what was going on, but the fact that he managed to actually tell the story on a very human level, the cultural kind of clash between the young American ping pong players on Tiananmen Square and the Chinese, who were all surprised to see a bunch of foreigners just walking around on Tiananmen Square. And Norman Webster even, used his people skills to actually get a conversation going between the Americans and the Chinese, and would translate between one or the other. So, that actually gave us journalists in Beijing, Canadian journalists, kind of keys on how to actually approach China. Yes, there is the big Chinese story, but at the same time, when it is told through the human element of what the Chinese live, it's a much richer experience. And that's what I got from his journalism. How we got acquainted, in a sense, is through his son, Derek. I was launching a book in Montreal on China a few years ago, and he showed up and he said, "I'm Norman Webster's son, and I would like to give him the book." So I signed the book for Norman Webster, and there we went. And I got a call a few weeks ago saying that, Derek wanted me to be part of this, and also I asked him to have the book signed by Norman Webster to be sure that we would have reciprocity in its sense. And it is a marvelous book. It is a marvelous book, not just on China, but on his coverage of other places in the world, of the Canadian scene also. And you sense the same respect, humanity in his writing, and the same doggedness of getting the story right. And as Joan has said, of writing what he saw despite the consequences. And this, I think, is a valid and non-ending lesson for any journalist of any age.